fast, 5/25/77. It's interesting, and strangely prolific that the tagline, one of the taglines for the original Star Wars when it came out, and they showed the original trailer a couple times in this film, is an adventure billions of years in the making coming this summer, or something to that effect. And that is incredibly ironic when you consider that this movie, it's taken almost 15 years for this to become available to a wide audience. There's a lot to talk about in this movie, the journey of it, and of it itself. So I want to get started. Before we get into that, let's just talk about what it's about so that I can kind of transition in as smoothly as possible. So this is a semi-autobiographical film about director Peter Reed Johnson, who is a very underrated director and who I feel a certain kinship with because he directed one of my all-time favorite movies, a movie called Angus, which I did a very long Forgotten Gems review about during the quarantine. But Angus is one of those movies that really, really touched me and felt like it was a film that was made just for me. And so I have always felt a kinship to that movie and a deep loyalty to the actors and creative personalities behind it, and of course the director, Patrick Reed Johnson, being among them. And when I heard he was going to be doing this movie, I was very excited. So anyway, it's a semi-autobiographical film about him growing up in a small town in Illinois, very inspired by the movies. He starts making movies at a young age. You know, the typical story. I'm sure a lot of us have that story, you know, making movies with their friends and creating weird special effects. And of course, he's the film geek, the only film geek in this town in the 70s when film geekiness to this extent was still fairly abnormal. We don't really get how good we have it living in this day and age of information and fandoms, but being as in-depth a film fan as he was, especially in the 70s when, you know, a lot of these auteur directors, Spielberg, Lucas, Coppola, you know, all of these guys, what's his name? Kubrick. You know, all these guys were just starting to make a big splash and starting to create kind of film fandom. So he becomes obsessed with movies. He ends up getting to take a trip to Hollywood where he gets to see an early version of Star Wars. He becomes obsessed with it. When the film is getting ready to release, he's trying to get all the people in the town to go see it. And of course, they think of him as a geek. And it's his coming of age, where do I belong kind of story. We've seen a dozen of stories like this prior to this. And I think we're about to get a new one, which I believe may be why they finally made this film available. Before we get into the film itself, let's talk a little bit about the history, because there's a lot going on here. So, as I said, I'm a deep lover of the movie Angus, and I was very attentive to the actors and creative people behind it. And I had heard, I forget exactly where, that the director was working on this film about the release of the original Star Wars. And I think at some point, I could be wrong about this, but I'm fairly certain at some point, Charles Talbot, who played Angus, and Ariana Richards were supposed to be involved in this movie in some way, shape, or form. I thought, if I'm trying to remember, like 13, 14 years back, movie news. So I was very excited to hear about this. And I remember there was a trailer for it, and you can still find the original trailer for it, around 2013, around the time, shortly after I moved to Tennessee. There was a trailer for it, and then you heard nothing else about it. Not a thing. It just vanished off the face of the earth. You couldn't find any information about it. And then suddenly, a few months ago, I see another trailer for it. And I'm like, is this the same movie? It's got to be the same movie. And because the two trailers are cut very different, they don't look like the same film. And of course, I hadn't seen the original trailer in a long time. But yes, come to find out, it is the exact same movie, which has finally been made available. Apparently, it had a very limited theatrical release in 2013, and it's finally gotten a theatrical and digital release now. And if I had to venture a guess, I'm going to say that the reason behind that is because of the new Spielberg movie, which is out, which is a autobiographical film about him as a young film fan making movies in the backyard and his relationship with his parents and all of that, sounding very familiar to this film. So I have a feeling, no proof of this, but I have a feeling whoever owned the distribution rights to this film said, hey, Spielberg's coming out with this movie. We have a movie very similar in our stable. Let's release it and try to get some of those residual dollars, kind of in the same way that, they used to release bootleg or cheap versions of upcoming Disney movies on VHS. I mean, they still do this. Scroll through the YouTube movies and there's like a cheap knockoff of Bullet Train and all sorts of other things. So I have a feeling that may be why they finally decided to release this film. And if that is the case, then I feel like it is going to give this film an unjustified reputation as just a cheap knockoff of this Spielberg movie. And I have not seen the Spielberg movie yet. I'm hoping to get to it this week. But, I mean, first of all, this one was made first, over a decade ago. But I feel like, just from what I've seen of the Spielberg film, I think there is a drastic difference between these two, just from what I've seen. Again, just from the trailers, it looks like the Spielberg film is very Spielbergian. It's cut, it's polished, it's glossy, it's Oscar fodder, it's, holiday movie shine. It's all of these things that you would expect from a Spielberg movie, especially at this stage in his career. And visually, artistically, structurally, this movie is none of that. This movie is dirty, it is ugly, it is it's cheap looking in a lot of places, but that is all by design. This film is a love letter to two things. It's a love letter to fandom, Star Wars fandom in particular, but it is also a love letter to anybody who made cheap home movies in their backyards as kids, as a lot of us did. I did. I made a terrible James Bond parody when I was in high school. I just got done last year making a movie with my students, and it is a love letter to all those people before all of this equipment became readily available. And for those of you who have grown up in the age of camera phones and camcorders, you don't know how hard it was and how unusual it was to have access to a movie camera, a home movie camera back in the day. And, I remember when I was in high school and filming it off my dad's old video camera, and there is a certain charm to those youthful experiments. I never went as far as this guy apparently did, but there is a charm and a beauty and a simplicity to those films, regardless of how cringeworthy they may be to us as adults going back and watching them now. But there is something very magical about that time and those experiments and those films. And this movie is very much trying to capture that feeling. And I think it does that. This movie is done in the style of an old home movie. For better or for worse. I think there are some great things about it that owe itself to that stylistic choice. And it can be a little confusing and a little disconcerting at first, because the film will just cut to some weird scene of Patrick reenacting Planet of the Apes, or it'll go all funky with scenes within scenes, and fantasy scenes a la Scrubs just out of nowhere, and weird homages to 2001 and Jaws, just, again, seemingly for no other purpose. But that is exactly the kind of thing that people making home movies or independent movies or whatever tend to do. You see something in a movie and you immediately want to copy that. It inspires you. It captures your imagination, and you instantly want to try to recreate it, regardless of if it is structurally important or if it adds to the story. You just want to ape that style. And whereas if this was done in any other kind of movie, I'd be looking at a lot of these things going, okay, that is just pretentious, out there bullshit that doesn't add anything and doesn't need to be there. And while that's still true, the point is, it's supposed to be pretentious, self-indulgent bullshit that doesn't need to be there, because that's what a young filmmaker would do. And it adds to the authenticity of this film. I think if there is a term that I would use to describe this movie, it is authentic. It is genuine. It is earnest. And you can't help being caught up in it. Again, in the same way that we got caught up making those films as young people. It's the earnestness of it. It's the desire. It's the fun. Regardless of how cheesy they may be 20, 30 years later. And I think that's what this movie is really trying to capture. It also does this in the way the script is written. The script is a little overwritten. I'm reminded, in terms of the writing, it reminds me a little bit of Clerks, and how Clerks is very heightened in its language and speech patterns. I know you don't believe that because of all the profanity and pop culture references in it, but if you listen to the way the characters talk, it is still a heightened, more poetic form of speech than what people normally talk in. And again, that is the tool of independent filmmakers, because they don't have a lot of budget for special effects, so they pour everything into the script. And especially when you're young and you're trying to say everything you're feeling and thinking and all of these big thoughts that you have, the script can come out a bit overwritten from one who knows, and has been told that multiple times. So the script is a little overwritten, and the dialogue is a little west of realistic. But again, that serves the story. It serves the plot. It serves the tone that they're trying to create here. And as such, it feels more endearing than it does distracting. Again, I want to talk about this. This is also in terms of the acting, I should say. A lot of these actors, and I looked them all up, is that there's not really a big name or a solo actor really in the bunch, with the possible exception of Austin Pendleton, noted character actor, who gives a great performance in this. But these are all, writers, producers. There's not a lot of acting credits amongst them. But they've had their hands in some fairly important projects throughout the years. And again, that serves the purpose of the film, because that's what you'd get when you would make one of these. You wouldn't get professional actors. You get your friends. You get your parents. You get your theater kids. So yeah, you're not going to have a lot of the professional actors in there. And again, the acting is very good, and it fits the authentic amateur nature of the film. And I brought that up because I want to talk about Austin Pendleton in there. Again, kind of the only real, I don't want to say name, but he is kind of one of the only recognizable actors in there, who gives an outstanding performance as the editor of this film magazine, which our young hero is obsessed with, and who acts as kind of the gateway to him meeting Steven Spielberg and getting to see the early cut of Star Wars. And he has just what may be one of my new favorite film monologues, where he talks about how when he was young, they used to have the short films before the movies, serials, which I am a huge fan of. And he says everything I have been saying about serials for years, that yes, they're cheap, yes, they were goofy, they weren't well made, they had like C, D, E level talent in front of the camera and behind it, but there was something incredibly endearing and fun and lovable about those films. And that it's the small films, it's the goofy shit that catches our imagination and makes us want to have more and to dream big. And I loved that monologue. It was a great, well-written monologue, and he performed it perfectly. That all being said, and that all being true, this is not a perfect movie. As I said, it really does capture the feel of an independent film, a self-made autobiography kind of thing, for better and for worse. And it does have some of the bad, or not bad, but some of the less desirable aspects of that type of filmmaking. Number one, it is too long, especially towards the end. It's a 2.5 hour long movie. And these films either tend to be very short because you don't have a lot of budget, or very long because you're trying to get everything in there and you think everything is important and you haven't cut out the dead weight in it. And I think this film, especially the third act, needs to be cut down, because our main hero goes through a lot and has like 4 or 5 climaxes and endings. There's more endings in this and more character, arrival moments than in Lord of the Rings. And towards the end, you're like, are we ever gonna get to the end here, or is he just gonna keep having revelation after revelation after revelation? One is enough. I also have to say, and this is where things get a little dicey for me, especially knowing that this is an autobiographical film, meaning that the writer and director, this is supposed to be him. I mean, he doesn't even give the character another name. And that is that, as portrayed, our main character is not really all that likable. I don't know if that was an intentional thing or not. I'm going to guess not. But our main character is a very self-involved, self-important, not really giving a shit about other people's feelings or thoughts or desires if they conflict with his own. And the justification is because, well, he's a dreamer and a film geek, and because he's an outsider, that means that it's okay that he doesn't really listen to other people and doesn't really take other people's cares into account. It's all justified because, he's so much bigger and brighter than this town. And that's a common problem that films like this tend to fall into. They tend to fall into this idea that because someone is a creative thinker and because someone is an outsider, that makes them somehow better than the people around them. And it's a common fantasy amongst nerds and creative nerds. I won't lie and say that when I was young, most of my stories and creative output were all about how I was the greatest human being that ever lived, and everybody who ever thought less of me was somehow a cretin who just didn't get it. It's a very, very adolescent view of the world. And I think that's fine for a character if part of their arc is realizing that is not true. And I don't feel like that is what happens to this character. I think it's what they tried to have happen. He has a scene there towards the end where he talks about how he doesn't want to leave the town that he's in. But it's almost immediately cut short by him realizing that he does have to leave the town. And his girlfriend doing a Lassie come home of, go away, I cheated on you, you go away, to get him to leave. But it never feels like he ever kind of comes around to the fact that, just because other people in this town don't share his big dreams, that doesn't make their dreams any less important. You know, I'm reminded of this great line from Fighting with Your Family, the Paige biopic from a few years back, where she tells her brother, just because a million people don't line up to watch you do something, that doesn't mean it's not important. And I feel like they try to get that point across, but again, this is where the muddying of the waters of the end of the film and the third act tend to come in, is because there's so many things happening in that third act. I think that message gets buried, and I don't feel like our character ever has a sense of realization of how he's been acting to the people around him. And it makes him a fairly unlikable character. I don't believe that was the point, but I think it is what happened. And you got to be very careful with a film like this and a character like this. And I'd be curious to know what director Patrick Johnson thinks of this movie now that he is over a decade older. And I mean, he was still an adult when he made it, but, you know, hindsight, even when we're adults, you know, looking back at how we thought of things in our 20s and 30s is an interesting thing. So I'd wonder if he would see that in this character, or if that was the point, if he was trying to say, you know, I was kind of a jerk, or, you know, I'd be interested to know that. So yeah, that is a downside to the self-indulgent nature of, and the independent movie feel of this, is it does tend to make our main character think that he is above everyone else, which I'm not a huge fan of, unless they learn from it, which I don't feel he really does. But all that being said, and all that being true, I still really loved this movie. I think it was well worth the wait. Not only is it a love message to movies, in the same vein that Cinema Paradiso and Their Finest are, it's also a genuine love letter to movie fandom, and a kind of a history of, like, how hard it was to be how hard you had to work to be a movie fan back in the day, and how as far as we come, we kind of have to remember humble origins. I mean, people can forget it now. I can forget it now when you look at Star Wars as this huge, monolithic, you know, cultural touchstone now controlled by the Disney Corporation, for better or for worse. You know, or you look at the works of Spielberg, who is now, his name is synonymous with blockbuster and quality and all of this. And you realize that those films, when they started, they were just film geeks themselves trying to emulate the things that they loved as kids. You know, Spielberg trying to remake horror movies in a less goofy light. You know, Lucas trying to emulate the serials that became the inspiration for Star Wars and Indiana Jones. That all these things started so simply, and that it's so easy for us as fans to get lost in the minutia and forget that, you know, these things started as creative people just being creative and going after the things they loved as children and trying to share those with the world on a larger scale. And whatever they became from that in the end, that's what it all started out as, just the love of it. And I think we could all do to remember that as we're griping about things on the internet, as we're going on message boards and Twitter and you know, TikTok and and everything to badmouth everything. Maybe take a moment to remember what it is that made you love these things as a kid. You know, especially, I'm way off base here, but especially when you hear people like bad-mouthing how they adjust the Marvel films, or everything being woke now, and that's like some dirty word in filmmaking. You know, go woke, go broke, which is not true. You know, but they're trying to make things that, you know, who knows? Look at Black Panther and how many young people that has inspired. Who knows what young filmmaker or actor or activist or whatever is in that audience as a young boy or girl and seeing that and going, that's what I want to do. And, you know, we need to think of that a little bit more. So, I think this is a really heartfelt movie. It has its issues, but I will take those issues if it gets me a genuine emotion. And I leave the theater, I watch this at home, but I leave the film with a genuine feeling of anything. That I felt like there was an actual emotion behind this movie. So I really enjoyed this movie, and I urge you to go check it out. So final grade for 5/25/77, I'm going an A, a solid A on it. Too long, too self-indulgent in terms of the main character, but so heartfelt, so genuine, and reacquaints us with the love of movies and the love of creating. So I endorse it, and please go check it out. It's been a long time coming. So all right, so there you have it. That was a bit of a rant, but I really enjoyed this movie, and I'm glad I watched it. So thank you for coming along with me. Thank you for joining me, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.